Here, the White House threatening to call off an upcoming visit to Washington by Afghan President Hamid Karzai because of his rhetoric. Karzai says he stands by his remarks in which he threatened to join the Taliban and accused the West of election fraud, suggested that U.S. soldiers may in fact be invaders, not liberators. Today, Peter Galbraith, former UN envoy to Afghanistan, suggests that Karzai might be on drugs. Take a listen.
Some of the palace insiders say that he has a certain fondness for some of Afghanistan's most profitable exports.
Of course, he's referring to heroin and hashish, although I suspect he's referring to heroin. Afghanistan, the world's largest heroin dealer, exporting it through heroin to Russia. Russia, the big heroin consumer. Russia makes guns, sends the guns through Iran back to Afghanistan. That's a handy little economy they have worked out at this point. Here to mix it up in our panel, editorial writer for The Washington Post, Jonathan Capehart, and editorial page editor for The Washington Examiner, Mark Tapscott. Mark, do you see any leverage that the United States has relative to Hamid Karzai at this particular point?
Only the fact that we have thousands of troops and we've spent billions of dollars there to
but let's be honest, we all know that, but at the same time, Karzai does not seem to be terribly concerned by that, other than the fact, I mean, yeah, we could kill him. I'm sure we could kill Karzai and take over, but and then what?
I'm not sure that there is a solution here because, let's face it, Afghanistan has always been a tribal nation. The loyalties of folks like Karzai have always been to the tribe first and the nation second. I'm not sure why anybody is surprised to hear Karzai say these things.
How much longer, Jonathan Capehart, or how does this affect the political support for the war in Afghanistan when you see the continued leakage of the sort of tapes that WikiLeaks is pulling out of Apache helicopter cockpits and rhetoric like this from our ally leading the war for liberation and fighting terrorism in Hamid Karzai?
Well, it could lead the left to continue, actually to say even louder to the president, get out of Afghanistan. During the campaign, the president always said that Afghanistan was the war of necessity, and it was the good war in that it was where Osama bin Laden and 9/11 were planned and hatched in that region, and so the United States needed to finish that mission there. But once the president laid down his plan for Afghanistan, the left went crazy and said, what are you doing? You need to get out. And I think what Hamid Karzai is doing is giving those folks and other reasonable thinking folks ammunition to say, hey, Mr. President, maybe we should rethink this again.
Does it matter whether he's on heroin or not?
If he's on heroin, yes, it does matter. Okay. I mean, come on, what are you kidding? That was a rhetorical question, right?
Good answer, Jonathan. Also today, the Pentagon, pushing back on the WikiLeaks video that shows civilians, including a Reuters video journalist, being gunned down with a U.S. Apache helicopter 30mm machine gun, follow-up fire after they were injured, with the cockpit audio of the Apache pilot begging effectively for the right to be able to shoot the injured individuals. Military officials say machine guns and grenades were found near the bodies. They also say that the journalists were operating near insurgents and made no effort to show they were members of the press. Now, the brother of one of the Reuters employees says he does not understand how U.S. pilots could mistake a camera for a rocket launcher. You can go back and forth on the fog of war and mistaken identity, and I think there's a very strong case to be made many ways here. But Mark, how long can the government get away with the perception that they're covering these types of incidents up, whether they were the ones reported in the New York Times over the past couple of days or these WikiLeaks video leaks?
The cover-up is always worse than the crime itself, if it's a crime that we're talking about. But I think it's important to remember here, Dylan, if the pilot and the gunner in that helicopter had known that there were two blue journalists on the ground, they wouldn't have fired. They didn't do this on purpose.
I don't think anybody. It goes to the suicide by cop. I'm not by any stretch here indicting the pilots, but I am questioning the information that's made available to the populace as we evaluate the reality of war, which is this sort of thing happens for the very reason that you're at the peak of a surge in one of the most highly conflicted areas of Iraq at the most violent period in the surge. RPGs have taken down other helicopters, and the soldiers soldiers in that Apache were obviously very anxious and fearful, and whether they follow the rules of engagement or not, no one views this as positive towards either the war on terror or security or anything else. Jonathan, how does this affect the politics?
Well, I think what needs to happen is, I mean, this video, when you showed it yesterday, it was pretty shocking. And I think what needs to happen is we need to find out exactly what happened. I mean, have we heard from the pilots? Have we heard from anyone from the Pentagon aside from saying that, this happened? When something like this happens, whether it's friendly fire or, as you described it, suicide by cop, how is it possible for pilots and gunner ships not knowing that someone is a journalist or not being able to tell a gun from a camera? I think we need to find out that for sure through an investigation, not through guessing.
Yeah. But Jonathan, even when we have answers to all of those questions, we're still not going to be at a point where we can say this incident or similar incidents is grounds for example, pulling out of the effort in Afghanistan to begin with.
Oh well, that goes way too far in my book.
Absolutely.
You can't take a single incident like this and then spin that into a reason for getting out.
Yeah, I guess my only other thing I would object in that is that this is not a single incident. We know that there are multiple incidents like this, that this is the reality of war.
Right.
And it has been. This is the reality of war in Vietnam. It's the reality of war in Iraq, and it's the reality of war in Afghanistan today. And at the very least, if we're going to discuss using our military to achieve security through these mechanisms, let us at least understand what we're talking about in terms of the human beings involved, both those in helicopters and those who are not.
But Dylan, I think it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. There is no military in this world today, and probably not at any time in this world, that has been more careful about trying to minimize friendly fire and civilian casualties than the U.S. military. Let's give them credit for that.
No question. I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that that's why it's so startling when you see at our best and with our best protocols the reality of war, period, whether it's the Russians at war in Afghanistan. I mean, we'll go through it. We don't need a war lesson. But this is the reality of what happens. Yeah. And when we're deploying in this manner, for me, the debate is if our objective is security, if our objective is to infiltrate terrorist networks, at what point does the deployment of our soldiers in Apache helicopters in urban warfare help that, and at what point does it not? Let's talk about something a little easier to resolve anyway, potentially, and certainly more frivolous. The opposition party, the RNC, and their Strippergate controversy. Apparently it's claimed another casualty, Mark. RNC Chief of Staff Ken McKay stepping down from his post. This latest attempt at damage control comes, as you likely know, a week after the RNC fired the staffer who expensed a couple of grand at a Hollywood sex and bondage club. The controversy has raised some new questions about Michael Steele. You know all this business, Jonathan. At what point is this a real political issue for the RNC?
Well, if the American people think that Michael Steele embodies the Republican Party and its ability to lead or handle a checkbook, then it's a huge problem. But what we're seeing is, while Steele is having his problems, the Republican Governors Association, the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee, they're pulling in money hand over fist. They're doing just fine in raising the money that they're going to need to win the races in November. You know, Michael Steele is not, he's in trouble. He keeps shooting himself in the foot. Controversies seem to pop up every other day, but the guy isn't going anywhere anytime soon.
Mark, if you were to look at the opportunity and the sort of best efforts for the Republican Party going into November, how would you counsel them to be the most, not only just successful politically, but the most useful structurally? In other words, how does the opposition party really add value in the long list of current debates?
Well, speaking as the only one of the three parties in this conversation who is a former Republican National Committee employee back before I was a journalist, I can tell you the problem is the same today as it's always been. The RNC thinks that it's got a monopoly of wisdom on how to win elections, when in fact they probably have the least compared to a lot of other people that are actively seeking office. What they should do is stop being the experts and start listening to the experts who happen to be out in the field with places like the Tea Party.
Yeah. Listen, Mark, Jonathan, always a good conversation when you two are here, and I appreciate it. Thank you, guys. Have a good
Thanks,
afternoon.
Dylan.
All right.